It was a historic journey that paved the way for future generations. We sit down with the Canadian who was on board. I'm Jackson Proskow at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. A special edition of the West Block starts right now. We sit down with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen, fresh from a mission that changed his life and the future of space exploration. But first, finance ministers around the world are sounding the alarm over the war in Iran. Ottawa's help starts tomorrow at the gas pump, but we find out what could be done to help even more. A big focus of last week's World Economic Forum in Washington was, of course, the financial effects of the war in Iran. The reverberations are expected to continue for the markets and consumers for months. Ottawa has responded in part by dropping the tax Canadians see at the gas pump.
What the government is proposing is to cut the excise tax, 10 cents a litre for gasoline, 4 cents on diesel. We've already cut the consumer carbon tax, 18 cents per litre. We are recycling all the excess revenues from higher oil prices to Canadians.
It starts tomorrow and will last until Labor Day, but it's just a drop in the bucket. Canadians are now being warned their grocery prices will jump as food suppliers pass their rising fuel prices onto grocery stores.
And the shock is global.
Last week's International Monetary Fund meetings, which Canada's finance minister attended, were supposed to be about trade and growth, but the Iran war quickly took center stage.
Even if the conflict is short-lived, extensive infrastructure damage and supply chain disruptions are pushing prices up and slowing global growth down.
Joining us now is Henrietta Treyz, Director of Economic Policy at Vita Partners near Washington, D.C. Henrietta, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
At the International Monetary Fund Forum in Washington, D.C. last week, finance ministers from more than a dozen countries pushed for an end to the conflict, saying, quote, renewed hostilities, a widening of the conflict, or continued disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would pose additional risks to global energy security, supply chains, and economic and financial stability. So what came out of that?
The most important developments from the IMF, to my eye, is that we had a first opportunity to hear from some of the really truly impacted sectors and companies and nations exposed to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, as opposed to just hearing, as the US did and the rest of the world did, from earnings reports last week, just from maybe the big banks and the White House. So it was our first opportunity to hear in real time, since the strait has been closed, how the impact is starting to trickle down and hit not just Southeast Asian nations and Asian nations, as we know, but also the industrial inputs. So the background talk was around, the impacts to jet fuel, the impacts to fertilizer costs, how price increases are going to start flowing to the U.S. consumer. It was a really good hands-on feel of how the strait closure is going to hit us tangibly, as opposed to just the focus on how things are going from the White House's perspective, or maybe from the economy overall as we weather the last 48 or some odd days of the shutdown.
We've heard for a while now about the possible effects of a fertilizer shortage. Why is that so significant, and what could the ripple effects look like?
Fertilizer is a whole different ball of wax than crude or diesel. There are no global stockpiles of fertilizer, not in one country in the world. So you might have a strategic petroleum reserve, you might have strategic reserves of natural gases or cooking oil in the case of India, for example. But when it comes to fertilizer, nobody has a big pile of fertilizer sitting around. So when you have a blockade and you have stoppage of flow, that's it. It just immediately ceases to exist for your buyers, for your farmers. And the way to think about it is that in your price of food, 40 to 50% of the cost of anything you're buying at the grocery store that's grown from planet Earth comes from the cost of fertilizer and the cost to grow it. And that's not even really including the cost of the diesel it takes to have a backhoe or a John Deere, Caterpillar, different farm machinery to actually get it out of the ground or to till the ground. This is just the fertilizer that you're using to grow the tomatoes or the corn or whatever it is.
At those meetings, the financial effects of the war in Iran really seem to take over discussions. What's the most important topic that came out of that?
The issue for consumers that I would like to focus on is that we really haven't experienced the full brunt of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz yet. And I think that was really clearly telegraphed. You're starting to see that as the White House promises aid to farmers who are dealing with fertilizer shortages. 70% of U.S. farmers report that they have not bought fertilizer for this next season. And as the strait is closed and so much of the helium and nitrogen and urea and components that go into fertilizer and other inputs, even including semiconductors, start to be extraordinarily expensive, and we've got to buy it now. I think one of the other really key parts that was very realistic from the IMF meetings and from the other ministerials is that the strait being closed is just one part of this overall dynamic. We have 80 different facilities that have been bombed out as a result of this war, including the largest LNG facility on Earth. So the real world acknowledgement of the fact that this is not just going to take a couple weeks to clear the backlog of tankers in the strait, but months, if not years, to rebuild the facilities that have been bombed out all around the Gulf, from Kuwait and Oman, and of course, Iran.
Relating to the pain caused by the Strait of Hormuz shutdown, who's hurting the most from that, and how do you expect that to change in the coming weeks?
I think the closure of the strait is going to continue to be a problem, even if it's fully reopened and even if we got back to the 130 ship flow that we had before the shutdown occurred. And that's nowhere near where we are today. So if you think about the flow through and the fact that many of these ships are still traversing oceans that left before the war even started, the hit really has been exacerbated in developing nations around Asia, Southeastern Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia. That region is overly exposed to Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. So they have been feeling and dealing with the shock for many weeks now. You know, they've cut back in a way that can only be really compared to COVID. So they have in Thailand, for example, a 3-day work week because they're trying to conserve fuel even for mass transit. But as we look into the European Union, we see that in the next couple of weeks, because there's such a high price and now crunched exposure and availability of jet fuel, for example, we're still expecting to see flights canceled. Flight prices remain extraordinarily elevated, and that is expected to continue to worsen in the weeks ahead as they deal with even a backlog reopening the strait. There's still going to be a big problem getting that jet fuel out. On the U.S. side and the North American side, we have a lot more of our own domestic quantity and availability of LNG, of natural gas, of crude, and that's true across Canada and the United States, and I suppose we should even add it in Venezuela now.
In Canada tomorrow, Ottawa will be dropping the excise tax for consumers on fuel at the gas pumps and on diesel and aviation fuel as well. Do you expect other countries to follow suit?
Yes, indeed, I do see other countries following suit, including the various states in the United States. So Canada is instituting that suspension. Georgia in the United States already did that as well. They had a 30% state level tax that they suspended a few weeks back. What's interesting about the tax suspension is that it is immediately relief to the US consumer or the Canadian consumer or anyone else. But should prices go back up, that gets eaten up pretty quickly. In the Georgia case, we saw that they effectively did the tax cut too soon, the suspension too soon, and prices for gas went straight back up, largely because prices just kept rising. So other nations, to weather this storm and to provide some consumer relief, may put that through. Another really interesting dynamic here, and we are hearing from the EU nations that have met and tried to come up with a peacekeeping mission around the Strait of the Hormuz closure and the US-Iran war, is this idea of not imposing bans on exports and not imposing protectionist policies, because that ultimately ends up in higher prices for everyone globally. So the idea of a gas tax suspension or a diesel tax suspension is actually really good domestic policy because it doesn't impact the flow of available commodities globally. So it won't impact the price globally, but it does help your consumers immediately and your constituents. It's a really good domestic policy idea that doesn't exacerbate the underlying problems.
What are your concerns for consumers, even if the war were to end today?
My concern for consumers is that the price hikes from the strait closure thus far have not fully baked in yet. the lag time on the food, for example, or even transiting goods from a port to your local store, those costs take 60 to 90 days from the start of any spike in oil prices to actually trickle down to the US consumer. The agriculture industry and the food industry anticipates that the full price hike for consumers from the Strait being closed for just as long as it has so far won't fully bake in until the first quarter of 2027. So for US consumers, this is a relatively long-term inflation risk. And of course, you've got the reality that 80 different facilities across the Gulf have been bombed out. So we're going to be in years worth of repair there. And it's going to take quite some time for crude prices to come back down to a point where they equate to anything like an equilibrium. For the American consumer, the stimulus from the One Big Beautiful Bill has been completely obliterated and taken away by just the cost of gas that we've had so far. And the cost to consumers is going to continue to creep upwards as the lag effects, again, 60 to 90 days before it starts to hit the stuff that's on the shelves at your store, really takes effect. So there's more pain to come from here.
Henrietta, thanks so much for sharing your expertise.
Thanks so much for having me.